there should be the winter of woe, Dana. And then after that, we shall have the spring of suffering.
Perfect. Yes.
Summer of bummer.
I know.
You want to take this?
Special safety zone so that children can grow up without being preyed upon by marketers. When I was a boy and the salesman would knock on the front door, my mother would just say, "Tell him I'm not home. That man is not getting into our living room." Well, I would say to my mother, "But you are home." "Not to him," she would say. Well, we need to give parents the ability just to say, no one's home for you and your company and your attempts to prey upon children, to get into our living room. That's our moment in history. We have to make sure that we respond to the challenge. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Markey, and my thanks to Senator Markey for his leadership over many years on protecting children. As you've heard, he was a champion in the House of Representatives before coming here, but well before I was in the United States Senate, but around the time I was elected Attorney General. I've been very pleased and honored to work with him on legislation now going forward, and I join him in thanking you. I have just a few concluding questions, and I seem to be the last one left standing here, so the good news is I don't think we'll have others, but as you may know, you do know, my office created an Instagram user identified as a 13-year-old girl. She followed a few easily identifiable accounts on weight loss, dieting, eating disorders, and she was deluged, literally, within a day of content pushed to her by algorithms that, in effect, promoted self-injury and eating disorders. Are you surprised by that fact?
I'm not surprised by that fact. Facebook has internal research where they have done even more gentle versions of that experiment, where they have started from things like interest in healthy recipes, so not even extreme dieting. And because of the nature of engagement-based ranking and amplification of interests, that imaginary user was pushed, or that real account was pushed towards extreme dieting and pro-anorexia content very rapidly.
And that's the algorithm.
That's the algorithm.
That algorithm could be changed.
The algorithm definitely could be changed. I have firsthand experience from having worked at Pinterest. Pinterest used to be an application that was heavily based just on you follow certain people's pins, and those are put into your feed. And over time, it grew to be much, much more heavily based on recommendations, that the algorithm would figure out, what are you interested in? You can have wonderful experiences that are based on human interactions. So these are human scale technologies, not computers choosing what we focus on.
So the average parent listening here, worried about their daughter or son being deluged with these kinds of content, would want that kind of algorithm changed, I would think, and would welcome the oversight that you're recommending.
I believe parents deserve more options and more choices, and today they don't know even what they could be asking for.
I just received by text, literally about 15 minutes ago, a message from someone in Connecticut, and I'm going to read it to you. It's from a dad. I'm in tears right now watching your interaction with Frances Haugen. My 15-year-old daughter loved her body at 14, was on Instagram constantly, and maybe posting too much. Suddenly she started hating her body dysmorphia, now anorexia, and was in deep, deep trouble before we found treatment. I fear she'll never be the same. I'm brokenhearted. I think people tend to lose sight of the real world impact here. And I think that's the reason that you're here. I'd just like to invite you, if you have any words to those other employees at big tech, the workers who may be troubled by the misconduct or unethical conduct that they see, what you would tell them.
We live in a pattern that we have seen throughout time with regard to technologies is that humans are very crafty people. Like we find interesting solutions, but we often get out over our skis, right? We develop things that are of a larger scale than we really know how to handle. And what we have done in the past is when we see this happen, we take a step back and we find institutions and we find frameworks for doing these things in a safe way. We live in a moment where whistleblowers are very important because these technological systems are walled off. They are very complicated. They're things that you need to be a specialist to really understand the consequences of. And the fact that we've been having the exact same kinds of false choice discussions about what to do about Facebook, is it about privacy or oversight? Is it about censorship or safety? Like the fact that we're being asked these false choices is just an illustration of what happens when the real solutions are hidden inside of companies. We need more tech employees to come forward through legitimate channels like the SEC or Congress to make sure that the public has the information they need in order to have technologies be human-centric, not computer-centric.
Thank you. On that note, we'll conclude. Thank you for an extraordinary testimony. I think that anybody watching would be impressed and much better informed. And you've done America a real public service, I think.
Thank you.
The record will remain open for 2 weeks. Any senators who want to submit questions for the record should do so by October 19th. This hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.
We take you live now to a House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing where former government officials serving different presidential administrations testify on the Afghanistan withdrawal. We join this hearing in progress. Live coverage on C-SPAN.
Your job, which is asking questions, and I'll do the best I can to try to answer your question. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. McMaster, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Meeks, Representative McCall, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be with you and my friends on this panel. I focused my statement for the record on describing the causes of our self-defeat in Afghanistan, based on strategic narcissism and self-delusion. But I hope that we might also discuss the likely long-term consequences associated with the catastrophe there and what we might do to mitigate those consequences and begin to recover. The humanitarian, security, and political disasters in Afghanistan are just beginning. The Taliban are reimposing brutal Sharia. More Afghans will suffer. The numbers of refugees will grow. The ready-made hostage crisis that resulted from leaving American and allied citizens behind, as well as those Afghans who fought to preserve their freedom, will continue. Jihadist terrorists are gaining psychological, financial, and physical strength. A victory for the Taliban is a victory for jihadist terrorists everywhere, but especially for those based in South and Central Asia. The Haqqani network and Al-Qaeda are completely intertwined with the Taliban. They and other terrorist organizations are celebrating a jihadist victory over the world's superpower. They're using our surrender and withdrawal as ISIS used the establishment of the Islamic State in 2014 after our complete withdrawal from Iraq in December 2011 to recruit more to the cause from far beyond their emirate in Afghanistan. The Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan will give jihadists unfettered access to the lucrative narcotics trade, other illicit enterprises, state revenue, and diverted international assistance. But jihadist terrorist organizations are not only growing larger in numbers, more confident and richer, they are also becoming more destructive. Our humiliating withdrawal left terrorists with billions of dollars of weapons. Those weapons will be shared among the over 20 U.S. designated terrorist organizations in the terrorist ecosystem across Afghanistan and Pakistan. Because some of those groups have already turned against the nuclear-armed Pakistani army and government, it is not difficult to imagine terrorists gaining access to the most destructive weapons on Earth. It is for these reasons that I believe our self-defeat in Afghanistan and our broader disengagement from the fight against jihadist terrorists internationally in recent months has made jihadist terrorists more dangerous today than they were on 10 September 2001. Finally, we are already witnessing the political dimension of our lost war. From Tehran to Moscow to Beijing to Pyongyang, our adversaries are emboldened, and our friends and allies doubt that we are trustworthy. Thank you for the privilege of being with you. I believe that this committee's oversight role may be more important than ever because the humanitarian, security, and political disaster in Afghanistan is the result of incompetence across multiple administrations. Unless the American people and their representatives in Congress demand better from our leaders, the prospect of learning from our searing experience in South Asia, rebuilding our strategic competence, and effacing the stain of 2021 will remain dim. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Ambassador Crocker for 5 minutes. You're on mute. Ambassador Crocker, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Now I hear you.
I apologize. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McCall, I had the privilege to see post 9/11 Afghanistan from different perspectives in different years. I reopened our embassy in Kabul, and the first week of January 2002. As it happens, it was Secretary Armitage who sent me there to do that. We never had a doubt about why we were there with that embassy. It was about America's security in its homeland. That never again would any kind of element be able to form in Afghanistan that could strike us as we were struck on 9/11. That was the case then. That was the case when I returned as ambassador in 2011, 2012. So I don't think there was ever really a serious question as to why we were there. What was our goal? What was our end that we sought? The differences came over how to do it. What are the means and ways? When I arrived, 800,000 students in Afghan schools, all of them boys. When I left in 2012, the number was roughly 8 million, some 35% girls. Was that a means to our end? Yes, to have an educated population, both genders, growing up, coming of age in a free, an environment of free speech and free media access. These things take a long time for fruition. And here I would just jump ahead to, I think, our ultimate cause of failure here and elsewhere. A lack of strategic patience. We are not good at the long haul. That is not how we built our own country. We want results. We want them now. If we don't get them, we'll move on to something else. And I think Afghanistan has now emerged as, sadly, the poster child for that failure of patience. I don't see it as gross incompetence. I don't see it as a confused appreciation of why we were there. We were there to defend America's security at home, defending it forward in Afghanistan. But we ran out of patience. This has bedeviled American foreign policy more than once. And indeed, it has fostered a culture long before America assumed the role on the international stage that we see today. Our enemies have come to count on our strategic impatience and our allies to fear it. And that is what we're dealing with today. What I would say as we look forward, or attempt to look forward, that we have to understand that our dangers have increased. Pakistan next door, I was ambassador there for 3 years. We saw the Pakistanis consistently gave safe haven to the Taliban, some of his most nefarious elements. Why? As they said it to me, it's their narrative. We know you're going to walk out one day. You walked out on us after the Soviet defeat. You'll walk out on us again, and we will not be left with the Taliban as our mortal enemy. So they probably had 15 minutes of high-fiving as events proved them right that we would go, but only 15 minutes because they're scared. The Taliban so-called victory has fueled Islamic extremists everywhere, and certainly in Pakistan, where the Pakistani Taliban aim at the overthrow of the government in Islamabad, not in Kabul. And I understand there is already a conversation underway as the Pakistanis try to address a greatly enhanced threat to their own stability and security as the Taliban hold increases and the Taliban message flows through the entire Islamic world where extremist groups feel emboldened. So how we got there is important. What do we do now? That's even more important. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize Ambassador Luke.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the committee, thanks for this opportunity to appear before you today to discuss this important topic. In this brief statement, I'll offer some thoughts on context for your work and the committee's work going forward, and also outline several lessons that I take away from U.S. involvement. First of all, context. In the face of the tragic events of the last several weeks, especially the collapse of the government, the evacuation that followed, including the suicide attack in Kabul, that tragically killed 13 Americans and over 150 Afghan civilians, it'd be natural to focus on the near term, the last several weeks, and ask ourselves, how did we come to this end? I believe, however, a more powerful, more useful assessment would entail a deeper and broader view. This defeat in Afghanistan, Chairman, as you mentioned, did not happen in the last 20 days or the last 20 weeks. It's the cumulative effect of the last 20 years. And despite all our efforts, all the sacrifices of our nation, our NATO allies and partners, and most significantly the Afghan people, we were unable to build an Afghan state that was self-sustainable and able to win legitimacy, sufficient legitimacy, among the Afghan people. We need to understand why. And then also on context, there may be a tendency to confine this assessment narrowly, only to Afghanistan itself. The full story, however, includes a much broader picture. The role of regional players, especially Pakistan, the capabilities and mindset resident in our military, intelligence community, and State Department, as well as our ability to integrate these parts into a coherent whole, and the policymaking processes across 4 presidential administrations here in Washington. Only a deep and broad examination will render a better understanding of how our involvement in Afghanistan ended as it did. Let me just tick off and offer for the committee several lessons. There'll be many lessons that come out of your examination and the histories that will follow. And let me just offer 4 that have to do primarily with forming and executing strategy. For the purposes of this conversation, I define strategy as the alignment of ends, ways, and means over time. That is the alignment of what we aim to achieve, the ends, with how we intend to do that, the ways, and ultimately the resources, the means required to do that work. If there are disconnects between ends, ways, and means, we do not have an effective strategy. And my first observation is there were often disconnects between ends, ways, and means. First, when we're setting our national goals, we must have a realistic picture of what's possible in the specific setting. A deep understanding of the setting must be grounded in facts, not emotions, hope, or aspirations. We should apply a healthy dose of humility as to what is possible in places as complex and as foreign as Afghanistan. In 2001, when we initially intervened, Afghanistan was a failed state. It was the 4th poorest country in the world. It had virtually no state institutions. It was deeply fragmented politically and largely isolated from the outside world. Setting lofty, ambitious goals to build a state with a strong central government in such a setting may have been beyond our capabilities from the outset in 2001, 2002. Second, once we set realistic goals, we must assemble the resources required. For the first 7 or 8 years of our experience in Afghanistan, we under-resourced the effort, especially as we prioritized the war in Iraq beginning in 2003. During the same period, that same initial 7 or 8 years, the Taliban regrouped and mounted a strong insurgency against the government and against our presence. As years passed, this gap between our goals and the resources we applied persisted and significantly decreased our prospects for success. Third, among the resources we did assemble and commit to Afghanistan, we tended to over-rely on military means, often providing too few or discounting the importance of political, diplomatic, and development resources. We very seldom achieved a balanced whole-of-government approach. We talk a good game about whole of government, but we seldom achieve it. And in the end, the collapse in Afghanistan proved to be as much a political collapse as a military. And yet it was the political arm that in my view, we discounted over time. Fourth and finally, we should remember on the positive front, and we should value the contribution of others. Our NATO allies in particular, tonight I just happened to be seated at the US mission in NATO where I'm doing some other work. But our NATO allies invoked Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause of the NATO Treaty, on the day after 9/11. They then stayed with us for these 20 years on the battlefield, losing over 1,000 killed in action. Important resources came from the UN, from the European Union, the World Bank, the IMF, and countless non-governmental organizations. We are the most powerful country in the world, but we cannot take and sustain interventions like Afghanistan alone. The lesson here is clear. Force cannot do all that needs doing, and all that needs doing cannot be done alone. Finally, one final point on lessons. I think most of us on the panel grew up in an environment, a culture, a military culture, a State Department culture, where we constantly try to harvest lessons. And I would guess what my fellow panelists
Also, if you wish, you can download our C-SPAN Now video app and monitor it there too. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.